Right. Welcome to Baseball Guys podcast, and we're so excited to be joined by Lee May Jr., who's part of the Prospects organization and has a long, storied baseball life we're going to get into on the podcast today. Lee, thanks for being with us.
Thanks for having me. I'm excited.
So first off, let's talk a little bit about your involvement with the Prospects, what you're going to be doing, and then we'll get kind of into the background, the bio, and the history of Lee May Jr.
I'm just going to be bouncing around as the hitting coordinator. There are a couple of teams I'm going to manage throughout some of the seasons, but just kind of seeing where the players are, seeing where baseball is right here, and just trying to be of service to add my experience wherever I can.
So your history in the game, like it's a true baseball life, and kind of starts with your dad, Lee May, and kind of that's where the formative years were. And you have the great stories about being around the Cincinnati Reds greats and kind of stretching throughout his 18-year big league career. So kind of take us through the formative years for you and what it was like being around those guys and learning the game from some of the greats.
Wow. So, not just my father, my uncle was also in the major leagues at that time as well. He had a 10-year career with the White Sox and Yankees, and ended up finishing his career in Japan. But just growing up and being in those clubhouses, seeing kind of the day-to-day life of, starting from, the big red machine with my dad being one of the original cogs in that machine and the players that he was around. And, at that time, that clubhouse, Sparky Anderson, the environment, the tone, the relationships, teammates holding themselves and their teammates accountable, just kind of, sitting and being a fly on the wall, literally, because my dad always had a policy where I could only come in the clubhouse or go shag if they were winning. But I always also knew that when I went to the clubhouse, I sat on this stool. I didn't get in anybody's locker. No matter even if they won, somebody went 0 for 3. Somebody, some pitcher went 1 in the third inning. So to be respectful of those guys around, but it really, showed me kind of the interactions and kind of, what a team and what a good team chemistry means and what that entails, the personalities and the relationships that those guys had. My dad, we had a GMC camper, and back then in the off season, the Reds had this barnstorming basketball team that would travel and go play basketball games against fundraisers for municipalities and school systems. But just seeing the way that those professionals went about their job really kind of shaped my experience.
So
The
you're
other thing
pretty
was, I'm sorry, go ahead.
Yes, you're pretty young then. What was, that like? Did you have a grasp as a kid as to kind of who your dad was and who these guys were that you were hanging out with in the locker room, or was that just kind of Pete
Yeah,
instead of Pete Rose or
yeah,
Johnny instead of Johnny
absolutely,
Bench?
absolutely. I mean, my dad's nickname was the Big Bopper. That's that it would be the equivalent of Big Poppy. But I went to school. I lived in Cincinnati. I knew how ingrained the Reds were and how important they were in that community, and that I got to see front seat, front row, the big red machine when they were when they're in their true glory, when they were becoming the big red machine. My imprint of how I played the game was Pete Rose sprinting after he walked. We sliding into third base. That's how we slid. I'm watching Hal McRae break up double plays. So that kind of really instilled on how the game was supposed to be played, and what we wanted to go outside and duplicate.
What were you mentioned kind of the on-field stuff as being some of the big lessons and how you played the game. But what did you learn about kind of the guys behind the scenes and the type of work that has to go into getting to where, those guys got, and how did that kind of stick with you? And also how does that rub off on others that you coach learning those lessons?
It was really small things but there were some other bigger things that I didn't really recognize until later on in my career.
Hmm.
There were a lot of lessons that I learned after the fact. But they all, still were lessons, and they still served a purpose. But at the time, what I really took from a lot of it, and what was always instilled with me, was being the first one at the ballpark and the last one to leave. My dad was always the last one out of the clubhouse, and on those days where they didn't win and we had to sit in the waiting room, my mom always knew, when somebody would come out, is he in the shower yet? No, he's still in there. But really, that was the time my father spent at the baseball field. When he came home, he came home. He never brought a game home with him. And really for me, my dad was special. There are a few players that I've seen where my dad didn't have any of his game bats at home. The bats that we had in our house were bats that were, all the autograph bats from World Series or an All-Star game bat. But the off season, my dad didn't pick up a bat. He went to spring training and got loose. At home was at home. If you look at all of the great home run hitters of all time, one of the lists that I point out to a lot of the kids is I'll read off some names, from Mark McGwire to Hank Aaron to Ken Griffey Jr., Freddie Freeman. And I started naming these names off and I asked them what list they think that is. And these guys are at the top of that list. And it's the all-time strikeout list. My dad is 70th on that list of all-time strikeouts in the major league. But not once did he ever bring a bad game home or a hat trick home, or it never changed his mood. And he went to the ballpark with the same attitude and the same mentality every day. He was going to work. So that was something that really stuck with me.
So your dad's career obviously was, as we mentioned, a long one, 18 years, and took you to Baltimore, took you to Kansas City, as well. And we talked about getting to know some of the Big Red Machine guys. Who kind of stuck out at you the most? You kind of really kind of liked, and you really liked the way they approached things. You mentioned Pete Rose's, the way he played the game stood out through that 18-year journey that you had a front row seat for. I mean, who was the guy that had the most impact, you think, on you?
It was kind of different because for me, they weren't just ball players; they were family.
Right.
So the family members that I obtained were, the McCray family. We met in Cincinnati, Ohio. Brian and I were both maybe 5, 6 years old. Tony Perez, the Eduardo Perez. I've known him since we were in Pampers. We were in
Of course,
the
he's
same
on.
crib
You see
together.
him on ESPN all the time now, doing the
Exactly.
Sunday night
Right.
games with David
Right.
Cohn.
Right. Elrod Hendricks and his sons Ryan and Ian. They were family. Eddie Murray. When Eddie Murray first came up to the major leagues, my father was the first baseman, and Earl Weaver was a very grisly manager to play for, especially for rookies. And in the papers and everything, Lee May was getting to that age where this new sensation rookie Eddie Murray's coming up. Is there going to be tension? But my dad really took Eddie underneath his wing and really groomed him into, the professional that Eddie is. And Eddie was like family. He would drive from California all the way out to Cincinnati to spend time with us in the wintertime. So it was those guys that, kind of influenced me more so the person, alongside from these are Hall of Fame players. So, you can't ask for very much more where, you're getting to watch this guy play on a daily basis, but also their family. Those were the guys. Now, as far as just being in awe and getting to see, special players, Bo Jackson is at the top of my list. But my dad was the hitting coach with Kansas City when Bo was there. So he was the most impressive player that I ever saw on a baseball field. But I'm also watching Dave Concepcion and Brooks Robinson and just some amazing players on a daily basis that it's too many. I was in awe of so much and saw so many special players. I got to sit in the locker room and watch seasons of George Brett and how he went about things, and watching him chase batting titles. Hal McRae, all those guys were the guys that you kind of followed. But The guys that I always liked were, no matter where you were in the stadium, you could be at the concession stand, but when Eddie Murray came up to bat, you made sure you saw every pitch because you don't want to miss something special. So he was probably one of the ones that was one of the guys that'll draw you out of the concession stand to stick your head up out of the gate just to kind of see every swing. Everybody's hinging on every foul ball. Every swing of the bat could be something special. So he was really special to watch. But
Yeah, when I first
no,
first started watching the game, Eddie Murray is towards the end of his career, but to me, he's probably one of the most underrated players in the
oh,
game. It's a
absolutely,
very slim category, that 500
absolutely.
home run, 3,000 hit guy
Switch hitter.
as a switch hitter as well. I mean, he was right up there. And Bo Jackson, probably the greatest athlete ever when you consider who he was as an NFL player and what he did on the baseball field, how difficult it is to play
Right.
baseball and hit the baseball. We saw that obviously with Michael Jordan.
Yeah.
Um, Bo Jackson's got to be right up there in terms of the best athletes ever.
Absolutely. And one of my favorite day of the summer was, when my dad told me I could come to the ballpark and shag. And when we were in Baltimore and I'd go to shag, Eddie Murray would just tell me to stand in the opposite gap of whatever side of the plate he was hitting. And he just shell me balls for the entire batting practice. So
That's
I, I
awesome.
I have him to thank for being a first round center fielder because I was shag. I did a lot of shagging for Eddie.
Yeah, so let's get to that part of the story now. Your first round draft choice, and your career and the lessons from that, because we kind of get the context of your breadth of baseball history and knowledge from being around the greats, and then there's your journey, which also adds a couple of different facets that are really important to young players.
Yeah, for me, all of the era that I was growing up in, the ball players that came just out of like my neighborhood were Ken Griffey Jr., Barry Larkin, Daryl Boston, Skeeter Barnes, Dave Justice. It was a really a hotbed. If you look at as far as when you look at where first round draft picks or those type caliber players come from, it was usually California or Texas,
Right.
some of those warmer climates. But for a good while, Cincinnati was really a hotbed of baseball, really because we had the big red machine and we watched how those guys played the game, and we played the game that way. But coming up in high school, my objective in high school was to be able to play baseball in college. All of my peers most were I hung around with my sisters and their friends, and all of their friends, their boyfriends were baseball players. They all went to Division I colleges. They weren't, they didn't play any further, but they were able to go to college and have baseball as a part of your college experience. So that was kind of my game plan and what my goal was in high school. And those guys drugged me around. I was with peers that were, saying, hey, no, we're going to sleep. You're getting to bed early because you've got a tournament tomorrow. They were taking me to tryouts with them. I was facing college players during tryouts, but it was in preparation for I wanted to go to school and be able to play my first year and not have to wait for an opportunity to play. But I wanted to be college ready when I came out of high school. So that was the way I went about it. And one of my teammates during the summer was Ken Griffey Jr. So we really pushed each other, and it was pretty cool because when I played with Midland of Cincinnati with Ken, we had this little thing we do where when we hit a no doubter at the plate, we kind of we before the bat flips, we would kind of admire our work a little bit. We stand at the plate a little bit longer, and our coaches used to scream at us, "Run, run!" And it's like, all right, I just clicked that ball. There's no need. There's not going to be any sprinting on this at bat. But we would kind of do this little pose, and sometimes we just see how far we could take it. Sometimes we take our batting gloves off and do stuff like that. But Griffey's finish turned into a Nike logo. So I
Yeah, he
think
was he was all right.
I think he won that contest. But every time I see that swingman logo, You see that signature pose at the end. It takes me back to those summer days where we were playing together, and that's what we did. We it's admiring your work, but how it translates into what I tell my hitters and what I look for in a cage is when you swing to have balance at the end of it. When I see guys swinging and falling over and everything, it's kind of disconnected. That being grounded and being able to hold that finish through your swing is something that I emphasize, but it's also something that I learned just through, those learning that, watching that logo be developed. So that's just a pretty cool, just one of those connections that, I see that logo and it just reminds me on, yeah, he won that one. That was we used to try to one up each other on how well we kind of back then. We didn't really call it pimping a home run. It was just admiring a little. You just admiring it a little bit, especially when you click one good.
Yeah, that's kind of statue pose, as you mentioned. Now the logo pose was legendary with him, but the swing as well. And kind of take me through that. And was that swing always there for Griffey? Because it was so beautiful. The hands, the hips, like so
He's
compact.
the
How he
he's the
finished.
purest, most gifted hitter ever. And the Griff was talented, just like my dad. They just fall out of bed. We call it. They just got that hitting gene. But that's what he had. And on the flip side of that, I watched Barry Larkin. He was one of the peers I looked up to. That was with that older group, and watching and just the Larkin family. It was just a house full of linebackers, and that's the mentality that they had. I think it was right after Barry had won like a Rookie of the Year or had an MVP season or something like that. We have in the neighborhood a little turkey bowl game where the younger guys will play, some of the older guys for, a tackle football game in Ohio. And Barry's out there dropping his head trying to get a yard for a first down, and we're all out there like, "Hey, man, a high ankle sprain away from some real problems." But that's just the way he went. His work ethic, the way that he was such a professional, and how he kept his body in shape and what he did equated to the longevity and the success that he had. Watching Eddie Murray every day, this guy wasn't trying to hit balls out of the stadium. He was hitting balls to the opposite gap. There were teams that would come out and watch him take batting practice because they couldn't believe that he wasn't just in there, hitting balls into the light tower. But he was preparing himself to do that. George Brett, sometimes he would walk past the mirror after he got showered and dressed before he's leaving the clubhouse, and he'd get in his setup. That those guys were just always on. You hear about Tony Gwynn and his routine, his tea routine down and away. It's like Walter Payton, those guys that are fanatical about their preparation. Those are the guys you see that be, kind of one of the catalysts to longevity, success, and playing at that elevated level. But then you have those guys that are just special, like my dad and Griffey, and I've seen a few guys that just have that natural swing. It's neat to see.
It feels like most of the guys have to be fanatical about their approach and about their swing if they are going to be great hitters. We'll take a couple guys with the Red Sox right now with Alex Bregman as an example, and a guy at the Red Sox the past where JD Martinez, where it was just constant cage work, constant working on their craft, trying to help others as well. And there are other guys, the guy you coached in Rafael Devers, where it's just very very natural and just kind of did his thing. There's some work there, as well. So is it kind of each guy is a little bit different, or is the kind of fanatical approach where you're just constantly, working on your swing, changing your swing, looking at your swing? And now with video work, everything's changed to the point where you could be even more fanatical, right? So
Yeah.
you're taping your BP, you're watching your BP, you're taping your cage work, you're watching that afterwards. So is there one approach that's better than the other, or do you find that most guys are kind of fanatical?
You have to be multilingual. You have to know how what his history is, How was he taught? Are you starting from zero? What way does he take information? You have to speak their language. There's no cookie cut way. Everybody's a little bit different. Some people can be analytical with their approach. Some people that takes them the wrong way. They've got to be, a little more abstract about how their approach is. But you just have to kind of meet each individual where they are. And being the more experience that you've had, the more you've learned different languages and kind of watched how to communicate, the better communicator you're going to be. You don't have to, you can't force everybody into your language or your lingo. You kind of have to find that common ground and kind of watch how their swing works, kind of put all the intangibles as far as what that outside noise might be, what they're listening to, what their influences are. And then you have to disseminate, okay, what's our game plan for how to work within your structure, and how can I fill in those gaps and speak your language to get you where you need to be.
Yeah, it's interesting because the more players progress and you get to the minor league or big league level, the hitting coach is kind of more like a consultant, right? Where it's like you're there to kind of figure out what works for them, and to look at what they're doing and kind of move things around a little bit and make them comfortable. When you're working with high school, middle school, or younger kids, do you take on that same type of approach of being the consultant, or are you more of, okay, this is how you hit, like? And I guess it depends on the age group too, and what their level of expertise, experience, and success, and what they're looking for. But how does it change in terms of how you work with kids? Is it, do you find yourself more as kind of a coach and instructor type, or is it kind of that consultant, here's how I help you type of role?
It doesn't change. You're meeting them where they are. And for most of the times with the younger kids, it's just like riding a bike. We've got to get our balance first. So you start from the ground up. So a lot of time with the younger hitters, you're teaching them how to walk. So you're teaching them how to be in their feet. You're teaching them how to be balanced. You're teaching them, and a lot of young hitters, you think swinging and you're thinking about your arms, but your swing is really generated from the ground up. So teaching them how to use their legs, how to be in their feet, how to be balanced is where you start, but you still have the same noise that you have with the young kid who's listening to mom and dad who are back there with anxiety because there's so much pressure on this kid, and they're watching him, play, but he hasn't, really fully been prepared, and he's still developing. You can't expect the finished result right away. It's just like, sending a kid to play in a concert. You're not sending him to piano lessons. He's just going to be banging on the piano. So a lot of times when you have a kid who hasn't really been trained or hasn't been to a really sufficient practice to learn how to play the notes, he's going to be banging on the piano. And that's what it's going to sound like. And that's what the parents are feeling when they're watching their kids bang on the piano. It's the same thing sometimes when they're watching a kid, they just sign him up for baseball and throw him out there and say, go play a concert. The kid's going to be frustrated because it doesn't sound good, doesn't look good. And the parents are going to be back there. It's a really, and there's a lot of anxiety. And just that energy, baseball's such a game of failure. So if you're not surrounded with that positive energy, that's your safety net. If you're failing and you have negative energy, that's just going to be a weight around that kid that's going to drag him down to the bottom. It's going to take the joy out of the game of baseball.
How do you judge, what's a good process, and what do you look for in terms of results? Because as you mentioned, it's a very difficult sport. There's a limited sample size. You go through a travel baseball season and you get maybe on average about 75 at bats. If we're judging a big league player or minor league player, usually the consensus is you don't really start to get 100 at bats, right? To try to determine whether where the results are at, just in terms of a statistical analysis. So when you look at, as a parent, giving advice to, say, a parent or coach, what would you say is the best way to determine, what success is for that individual? Is there other statistics? Everybody's kind of look at their game changer and they're like, "Is the batting averages and so forth?" Is it looking at how hard they're consistently hitting the ball? Like, how do you judge positive results in gameplay?
A couple different layers to that. So all that corny stuff we hear, when you hear that 1% better, that's really what you're looking for. Every day, you just want to be 1% better. There's something you can do, whether it's your diet, whether I got more sleep today. What did you do that got you just 1% better? And if you have that approach, you're going to continue to improve. And we are another saying, there's so many different sayings that kind of help shape your mind and your mentality to play baseball. Is we always say trust the process. You're not going to automatically see results right away. As a hitting coach, sometimes you'll make an adjustment with the player, and you're just hoping. I hope he has a good day, because if he has a good day and he gets some positive results, then it's going to be easier for him to be engaged in the process, knowing that it is working and I am seeing some positive gains out of it. For players, again, my evaluation as far as what success would look like, and what I would want them to gauge more so than the result is, am I hitting the ball hard? Am I centering the ball on my barrel? Sometimes kids will get excited about a result, and then they'll get taken a negative direction by a result that's actually a positive result. If I line out to the center fielder, that's a good at bat. You'll see kids slamming their bats and getting upset because they made an out, but then they'll have a bloop hit over the second baseman's head, and they'll be doing the celly at second base. So it's having to kind of reshape. Hey, I'm going to be more benefited, and I'm in a better place with my swing on that line drive. I got away with one over the second baseman's head, but if I keep hitting those line drives, I'm going to be in a good place, and I don't want to mess that up. Whatever I'm doing, that was a good approach. So I would gauge it more on, am I making hard outs if I'm making outs, as well as understanding that we're always evaluating, we're always correcting our mistakes. If I'm popping up, am I rolling over? We've got to get that information from our game at bats, so that now we can structure our preparation until that next weekend, going into that next weekend second set of games, that I'm addressing where those leaks were. Am I dropping my backside and popping up? Okay, I'm going to work on the tee this week. I'm hitting low line drives. But that's kind of the process that you kind of trust to kind of keep yourself from keeping those peaks and valleys from being real low. You want to keep them, kind of at an even keel.
Yeah, to me, of looking at analytics, the expected rate analytic is such a important one, because it kind of goes through what you're describing there of, you know, are you putting yourself in a position by being in consistent hitters counts and gaining count leverage to have success? Are you hitting the ball hard and those types of things? And that's, I think, an important one of the more important current analytics that are utilized. I want to also ask you about, for each hitter, they know their swing, or hopefully as they get into the kind of high school years are in tune with their swing, in tune with, their approach and their mindset. How do you go about teaching kids to kind of self-evaluate and diagnose, so that, when they are in game, when they're even in at bat, that they can, make those corrections or feel those things, or have, the appropriate approach for that at bat against that pitcher, to maximize their strengths, take advantage of the pitcher's weaknesses in order to have success.
That's the beauty of the process. That's what you're learning off of the tee. That's what you're learning off of front toss. When you're rolling over, that you have a feel for rolling over. But I always ask them why. Why did you roll over? What happened on that swing? So that they start to be aware of, oh, I rolled over because I didn't use my backside. I cut my backside off and I got disconnected. Or if I popped up, hey, why'd you pop up? I pulled my head up. I dropped my backside because I didn't keep my head down. So they're learning those things, and that's the process. Master the tee. Once I master the tee and I can put that tee in the middle of the plate, and I can hit 8 out of 10 balls off the back wall. I want to get to where that's a mastery, where I can do that with my eyes closed. Now I want to be able to control my barrel during the front toss session with good direction, back through the middle of the cage, middle oppo with my approach. Then I want to be able to do that from BP. And it's that progression. The better you get at one, then you level up to the next. As a hitting coach, that's what you have to evaluate. How far that tee work is going to translate into that next phase, which is going to translate into the next phase. So now in game, they have a reference point for why did they roll over. And sometimes it's mental, sometimes it's physical. Learning to evaluate. Okay, what happened there? And that's when you get into the psychology in the cage. Learning how to work through getting frustrated, not getting hijacked in a bad result, but taking that as an opportunity where I'm taking a self-test. If I can go back and look up the answer, when I get that problem the next time, I have the solution for it. So that's really what built in your cage work and learning your swing, learning your body, learning what your tendencies are. I know myself for the right side, I have a tendency to fly open. So I really have to make sure to have an off center gap in my approach, especially in my preparation. If I do that religiously in my preparation, when I get in the game, I don't have to worry about it. I've already locked it in. So knowing what my tendencies are, learning myself, now I get into the game and I know what my tendencies are and I know how to self-correct.
Yeah, I think that's a problem for a lot of kids, right? Is they want to hit the ball for power, hit it, down the line or in the power gap, and you'll see guys open up a lot. We talked a little about Rafi Devers earlier, but I've talked with a couple kids that kind of try to mimic his approach, right? And where it's you open up big, and you try to, and I'm like, no, you can't do that. Like Rafi Devers can do that, but he's kind of 101 in that situation. And yeah, I think what you expressed there, like getting that foot out a little bit so that you're not opening up as much, like that's a big part of hitting. And you see it with so many different guys is these little reminders that exist within their pre-pitch routine of this is what I want to do. And so I put my hands in this spot. I toe tap. I extend out a little bit with the front leg toward the opposite gap so that you open up straight. When you're going through and looking at a hitter and parents kind of watching what you're doing in the cage, like take us through kind of that process of diagnosing, like the kind of initial meeting with a hitter, maybe where you're kind of diagnosing, kind of talking to them and kind of figuring out, okay, this is where I have to put this person to have success.
Rafi's a perfect example. The pull side, that's a magical side that doesn't come until last. You look at, and what I've seen with a lot of really good hitters is that hitter who they complain he doesn't pull the ball, they can't pull the ball, he hits everything the other way. That guy's going to be a good hitter. He's not going to get into those outs. Those pull hitters, such as myself, when I was coming up, I got myself out a lot, rolling over on balls that it should have been hit to the other gap. When you have a hitter that eliminates that rollover out and those times of getting yourself out, as well as he's training himself to release from inside the baseball. So once you can release from inside the baseball, okay, now we'll go to that pull side. But you know that your slot is inside that baseball and you develop the swing where you're not going to work around that ball and hook it, but you'll be able to work your hands inside the ball and keep those balls fair. That's kind of the last step of it. But Rafi is a perfect example. And when I had him here, whenever he got in trouble, I used to have to remind him that his strength was to left center. And when you watched him this year with that slow start, when he broke out, he came home and started peppering the monster. He went back. So for me, one of the things that I've always been taught, and what what I saw, what I was taught from Mickey Brantley is that swings leak forward. So ground zero is, I show up to spring training. The pitchers have been there for a month. These guys are hot. And the second day of spring training, we're swinging the bats. So I'm not trying to work to get out front and pull anybody. I just want to bump a ball down the opposite line. So I'm just staying behind the ball. Once I start to get my timing, now I start to drive that ball to that off gap. Now I'm in the middle of the field. Now I've really got my timing. I'm catching a little more out front. Then I get out front, I start to hit some balls to my pull side, then I start rolling over. That reset is to go back the other way. So many times whenever hitters were going south or having a struggle, a universal aspirin was, okay, let's go out early and we're just going to hit balls the other way. So we're letting the ball travel, we're staying behind the ball, we're staying inside the ball. It's just a universal aspirin for how to set a swing up. So just yesterday, I'm talking to a high school hitter as far as how they approach setting their swing up for performance. And again, just like with Eddie Murray, your batting practice swings, these aren't the same swings that I'm taking in the game. I'm preparing that game swing. So if I preach to kids all the time, my first round of batting practice, I'm hitting everything the other way. I don't care if I hit foul in the cage the other way. That's a positive at bat. I'm a positive rep. I'm letting that ball get deep. I'm staying behind it. I'm on the right side of the baseball. Now I'll work out from there. And once I've established my hands back inside the ball, okay, now I'll step on a couple. I'll let it eat, and I'll drive some balls to my pull side. But I want to see that ball flight staying true and not hooking because I'm working around the baseball.
Yeah, it's a really good point on Devers, which I was actually going to bring up as well, where once he got right, a couple months prior to getting traded, he was hitting the ball oppo gap and was having a much better at bat this year than previous years, where his chase rate was way, way down. He was taking walks as well, which is, I think, an important thing for any hitter is if the walk is there, take it and to be selective. And Alex Bregman talks a lot about his approach being a very simple one in that he is just waiting for the pitcher to make a mistake and is getting to that point. He will foul pitches off. He will take pitches, but he is waiting for the pitcher to make a mistake over the middle of the plate. And then he's going to hopefully put himself in a position to capitalize off of that mistake. And, for all the complexity that we bring to hitting or pitching or to baseball as a whole, kind of gets down to that simple principle, right? Where you're just waiting for a good pitch to hit. You're waiting for a pitch that is over the plate that you can drive. And I thought, Bregman did a good job of kind of laying down what is kind of, a pretty complex approach that he has on a day in, day out basis, but it's very much for that simple goal of just driving the pitcher into making a mistake.
And the mental maturity to be able to stay in that mindset, as opposed to you're Rafael Devers and Bregman is there now. You've been moved out of a position. You could be the human side of you could press and try to do a little too much. That might be more out of character because you're pressing to make a statement. And like I said, there were a lot of times where I had to kind of. Carlos Santana was kind of the same way. He was so good that this guy in AAA would watch. All right, I'm at the top of the league in average, but somebody just passed me with homers. So for a couple games, he'd get real big until he got his homers and he caught up. And I say, hey, Pop, you're getting too big. Let's get back to that other gap. Those guys but that was the other thing with Rafi was, so when he was in Portland, we were getting, weekly calls from Dombrowski. Is he ready? Is he ready? And,
just for the time frame, folks, Lee was the hitting coach of the Portland Sea Dogs in that 17-18 time frame. 17 was when Devers came up and had an impact in the postseason that year. And of course, 18 was his rookie year. Go ahead.
Yeah, so I from my experience in AAA with Jason Kipnis and Michael Brantley and Carlos Santana, And that team that they had in Cleveland, when the big league club and the GM call you and ask you, is a guy ready? This is what you're signing off on. This is he's going to show up to the cage on time. He's going to know what the proper etiquette is for a rookie going up. He's going to, be a professional, as well as those on the field things. He's going to be able to move a runner. He's going to be able to get a bunt down. He's going to be whatever you ask him to do is going to be a reflection on what your evaluation is. So when you say a guy's ready, you're putting your stamp on him and saying he's ready. So I wasn't prepared to put that stamp on until he struggled. After he came out of that struggle and found that reset, he's ready. I think he might have played a couple games in AAA and then he went right to the big leagues.
Yep.
But you want him to have that failure in Portland, Maine, not up in Boston for the first time that this guy ever had any type of adversity in his career. And again, in Portland, it was the same situation where he was trying to do too much. He knew those phone calls were coming. He had had a taste of being with that team during spring training. He knew what an asset he was going to be, and he started pressing to do it. And it was the same thing that he did this year. He started pressing to do that. And when we slowed down and went back to, it was nice at Hadlock, we've got a monster there. He started peppering that monster for a little while, and he found his way out of it. So that adversity that he had in Boston, I knew he was going to be fine because he had been there before and he was equipped with the tool belt to get out of that situation. So that's kind of what you want to instill in your hitters, that you want to give them the tools and give them that manual for themselves that they're building in order to get out of those situations. If I break down, I've got a tool to fix it.
Leo's great stuff. Thanks for joining us on the Baseball Guys podcast, and look forward to seeing you around the mill.
I appreciate it. Thanks for having me. I'm excited about where we're at.
Cool. Good stuff.
Thank you.
All right. I got to run. Enjoy the rest of your day.
All right, you too,
and yeah, we'll go. We'll catch up soon on the other items, and we'll see you soon too. All right.
All right, man. Sounds good. Thank you.
Thanks. Bye.